Before it became a monument to ghost stories and a pilgrimage site for fans of Stephen King, the Stanley Hotel began as a dream. One man's improbable vision, rising like a white crown against the raw wilderness of the Rocky Mountains. The year was 1909. Automobiles were still a novelty, electricity a luxury in many parts of America. Yet freelance Oscar Stanley, inventor, entrepreneur, and co-creator of the Stanley Steamer automobile, was not a man who settled for the ordinary. He had already etched his name into history as a pioneer of engineering, building steam-powered cars that challenged the future of transportation. But at the height of his success, his health betrayed him. Stricken with tuberculosis, Stanley was told he had only months to live. Doctors urged him to seek fresh mountain air, and so he and his wife Flora traveled west, to the high country of Colorado. What happened next reads almost like myth. The crisp alpine air and sunlit peaks of Estes Park did not just soothe him, they revitalized him. His health improved, his strength returned, and instead of waiting for death, Stanley began to plan for life. Inspired by his recovery, he vowed to give back to this wild and beautiful land by creating something extraordinary, a palace in the mountains, a resort unlike anything the frontier had seen. Construction began in earnest. Rising from the valley floor, the Stanley Hotel soon stood as a beacon of elegance where wilderness once ruled. Its architecture was striking, a grand colonial revival style, white-painted walls glowing under the Colorado sun, red-roofed gables cutting a proud silhouette against the jagged backdrop of the Rockies. The design was deliberate, a blend of Eastern refinement and frontier ambition, meant to lure wealthy visitors from Boston, New York, and beyond. Here, among whispering pines and snow-tipped ridges, they would find not log cabins and rustic lodges, but ballrooms, electricity, running water, and telephones. When the first guests arrived, they were stunned. The long, sweeping veranda framed endless views of Long's Peak and the surrounding wilderness. Inside, polished wooden floors gleamed, chandeliers sparkled, and wide staircases beckoned with a promise of grandeur. The hotel boasted a concert hall, a billiards room, and a dining hall fit for the Gilded Age elite. At night, when lanterns flickered across the valley, the Stanley seemed almost unreal, a vision transported from the East Coast and planted in the rugged soil of Colorado. But the Stanley was more than architecture. It was ambition crystallized in wood and stone. For F.O. Stanley, the hotel symbolized progress, resilience, and the triumph of human will over both illness and isolation. In many ways, it mirrored the same spirit that would later define icons like the RMS Queen Mary. Creations built not simply for function, but for spectacle, testaments to an era when technology, wealth, and imagination seemed limitless. In its earliest years, the Stanley Hotel was hailed as a miracle of modern luxury in the wilderness. It offered not only comfort, but also an idea that even in the untamed Rockies, civilization could thrive, complete with fine dining, elegant music, and the promise of refinement. And yet, behind the glow of chandeliers and the sweeping colonial facade, the mountains watched in silence. They had seen civilizations rise and fall before. The Stanley was magnificent, yes, but it was also a fragile human dream, daring to stand in the shadow of nature's permanence. The grand beginning had set the stage. The Stanley Hotel was born from sickness, but rose in defiance of death. It was a palace carved from ambition, a beacon of early 20th century optimism. And, like all things touched by such grandeur, it carried within it the seeds of stories yet untold, stories that would, in time, blur the line between history and haunting. In its earliest years, the Stanley Hotel quickly became more than just a mountain lodge. It was a statement. At a time when the frontier still conjured images of rough cabins, mining camps, and untamed wilderness, here was a glittering resort that seemed transported from Boston or New York and set down in the shadow of the Rockies. To arrive at the Stanley was to step into another world, a place where refinement and wilderness collided in dazzling contrast. The guest list was proof enough. Wealthy industrialists, politicians, and society's upper crust journeyed up the winding mountain roads to Estes Park to spend their summers in opulence. They were joined by musicians and artists, men of letters and influence, all eager to breathe the crisp alpine air without surrendering the comforts of civilization. Electricity flowed through the walls when many Colorado towns still relied on gas lamps. Telephones connected the Stanley to the outside world at a time when such technology was rare and wondrous. Even the promise of running water and modern plumbing seemed almost miraculous in this remote setting. It was a playground for the elite, and Stanley intended it to be so. By the 1910s, the hotel hosted elaborate banquets in its grand dining room, with long tables lined in gleaming china and silver. Flora Stanley herself often played the organ in the concert hall, filling the night with music that drifted into the mountains. Summer evenings brought dances beneath glittering chandeliers, where men in tuxedos and women in gowns glided across polished floors as if the wilderness outside did not exist. For a moment, Estes Park became a jewel of high society, an enclave of sophistication far removed from the dust and grit of the American West. And yet, the isolation could never be ignored. The Rockies loomed on every horizon, vast and indifferent. Winters were harsh, the roads treacherous, and snowstorms could cut the hotel off for weeks at a time. Guests were pampered with luxuries, yes, but also reminded of where they stood, a fragile outpost of elegance in the middle of a rugged and unforgiving landscape. That tension between comfort and danger, between grandeur and isolation, gave the Stanley a mystique that no city hotel could ever match. Stories from those early years echo with a blend of glamour and unease. A senator once remarked that he had never dined so finely while feeling so far removed from the world he governed. A visiting pianist described the concert hall as a cathedral of sound, yet admitted that when the music faded, the silence outside felt almost oppressive. Guests admired the stars from the veranda, marveling at skies so clear they seemed infinite, but some confessed to feeling small, even vulnerable, under the weight of so much emptiness. The Stanley was, in every sense, a paradox. It was a resort for the chosen few, a haven of light and laughter in a valley that could easily turn inhospitable. It offered security, but never entirely banished the shadow of the wilderness. For the wealthy tourists who traveled hundreds of miles to find themselves in this unlikely palace, the experience was unforgettable, a cocktail of refinement and risk, of comfort laced with just enough danger to make the nights more thrilling. These contradictions would shape the Stanley's identity for decades to come. It was a place of music and celebration, but also of silence and isolation. A hotel that embodied progress and privilege, while hinting at something darker just beyond the glow of its chandeliers. Even then, before the ghost stories, before Stephen King, the Stanley carried within its walls an aura of mystery, as though the Rockies themselves had lent it a touch of their timeless, unsettling power. By the 1920s, the shine of the Stanley Hotel began to fade. The grand experiment, a palace of light and refinement in the wild Rockies, had thrived in its first decade. But time, like the mountain winters, is relentless. What had once been a marvel of innovation was beginning to feel like a relic of a fading era. The Roaring Twenties brought changes the Stanley could not easily keep pace with. America was modernizing at breakneck speed. Jazz filled the air of cities, fortunes rose and collapsed, and luxury was no longer limited to the privileged few who could make the long trek to Estes Park. As automobiles grew common and other resorts sprang up closer to urban centers, the Stanley's remote location began to feel less like a glamorous retreat and more like an inconvenience. Ownership changed hands, financial troubles mounted, and maintenance began to slip. The gleaming white facade dulled, its paint weathered by mountain storms. The once brilliant chandeliers hung over ballrooms less frequently filled with laughter. The great dining hall hosted fewer banquets. The concert hall echoed with silence more often than song. By the 1930s, in the shadow of the Great Depression, the Stanley was no longer a playground of the elite, but a struggling hotel fighting for relevance. And yet, even as the hotel's reputation declined, something else began to stir. Guests and staff whispered of odd occurrences, fleeting footsteps in empty corridors, soft voices where no one stood, sudden drafts sweeping through sealed rooms. Some dismissed these stories as the product of an aging building, with settling, pipes groaning, wind rattling through the valley. but others insisted there was more. The Stanley, they said, was not just decaying, it was awakening. Visitors described the strange contrast of grandeur and neglect. A senator's wife, writing in her travel diary in the mid-1930s, called the Stanley a house of faded elegance, noting that she felt as though she were walking through a stage set after the actors had left. Others compared it to a great ship, once triumphant, now moored and hollow, carrying only echoes of its glory days. The comparison to the RMS Queen Mary, another icon of the early 20th century whose golden era had already dimmed, is hard to miss. Both were symbols of ambition, luxury, and progress, now reduced to hollow shells haunted by memory. By the 1940s, the Stanley stood at a crossroads. New owners tried to revive it, to polish its image and draw crowds once more, but the world had changed. Air travel was replacing the long journey to mountain resorts. War and economic hardship reshaped the priorities of Americans. The grand vision of Freeland Oscar Stanley seemed a distant dream, like a sepia photograph left too long in the sun. Still, those who walked its halls during this time spoke of an atmosphere unlike anywhere else. The ballrooms may have been empty, but they felt alive with an invisible presence. The long corridors, dimly lit and echoing with every step, seemed to carry whispers from decades before. Guests wrote of feeling watched, of doors that seemed to creak open of their own accord, of music faintly drifting through the night when no orchestra played. The golden age had ended. What remained was a building caught between worlds, too grand to die, too neglected to thrive. The Stanley was becoming something new, something its founders had never intended, not just a monument to ambition, but a vessel for memory, mystery, and the uncanny. It was in this twilight period that the seeds of its future legend began to take root. The shell of the Stanley endured, waiting. And in its silence, in the long winters and empty rooms, the first real whispers of haunting began to echo through its halls. By the 1970s, the Stanley Hotel was a shadow of its former self. Once a crown jewel of the Rockies, it now stood half-empty for much of the year, its glory days long behind it. But it was precisely in this twilight state, faded, quiet, and isolated, that the Stanley found its way into literary immortality. In the fall of 1974, a young writer named Stephen King and his wife Tabitha checked into the nearly deserted hotel. King was already carving a reputation for himself, but he was restless, searching for inspiration. The Stanley, perched high above the town of Estes Park, was about to provide it. The Kings were told they were the only overnight guests that evening. The vast dining room was set with tables for hundreds, yet only the two of them were served. The silence was immense, the long corridors eerily vacant. That night, King wandered the empty halls. He passed door after door, their brass numbers glinting in the dim light, the carpets muffling his steps. It was easy to imagine ghosts of another era drifting just out of sight, wealthy guests in evening gowns and tuxedos, laughing, whispering, vanishing into the shadows. The sense of being watched was palpable, though the hotel was nearly empty. King and his wife were given room 217, a suite already known among locals for strange occurrences. According to legend, decades earlier, a housekeeper named Elizabeth Wilson had been injured in a gas explosion there, and some claimed her presence still lingered. That night, in 1974, the room became the crucible of a nightmare. King later recalled a vivid dream. His young son running down the endless corridors of the hotel, chased by a fire hose that had come to life, writhing like a snake. In the dream, the boy's face twisted in terror as he screamed, unable to escape the pursuing menace. King awoke in a cold sweat, heart pounding, staring into the darkness of room 217. The image was so powerful, so unsettling, that he rose from bed, lit a cigarette, and began to sketch the bones of what would become one of the most famous horror novels of the 20th century. By morning, the seed of The Shining had been planted. The haunted corridors, the cavernous ballroom, the isolated mountain setting, all of it would bleed onto the pages of the novel. The Overlook Hotel, as King named it, was born directly from the Stanley's bones. It was as though the building itself had whispered the story to him, using dreams and shadows as its language. But what, exactly, had King encountered that night? Was it simply the fertile imagination of a writer, primed by the eerie emptiness of a half-abandoned resort? Or was it something more? The lingering spirits of the Stanley seizing their chance to be heard through him? King himself has remained deliberately vague. He admits the setting was uncanny, unsettling, alive in some indefinable way. It was like the ghosts of the place were already telling their own story, he once remarked. For the Stanley Hotel, King's visit was both salvation and curse. It would never again be just a fading mountain lodge. From that night forward, it became the Overlook, the hotel that breathed nightmares, a place forever linked with terror, isolation, and madness. Fans from across the world would come not just to stay in room 217, but to chase the same unease that had seized King in the darkness. The question lingers even now, echoing through the halls. On that night in 1974, did Stephen King simply dream, or did he glimpse the hidden life of the Stanley Hotel? Was the shining born from his subconscious, or was it the hotel itself, whispering its truth through him? If the Stanley Hotel has a heart, a single room where its legends converge, it is room 217. For decades, guests and staff alike have whispered of its mysteries, weaving a tale that blends history with haunting. At the center of this story stands one figure, Elizabeth Wilson, the housekeeper whose name is now inseparable from the room she never truly left. The legend begins in 1911, just 2 years after the hotel opened its doors. That summer, a powerful thunderstorm knocked out the electricity in Estes Park. In those days, the Stanley still relied on gas lamps as backup, and room 217, like many suites, had its lines recharged with kerosene. Elizabeth Wilson, a longtime chambermaid, entered to prepare the room for arriving guests. As she struck a match, a leak in the line ignited. The resulting explosion tore through the suite with thunderous force, blasting the floor beneath her and sending her crashing down into the dining room below. Remarkably, she survived. Though badly injured, Elizabeth recovered and returned to work at the hotel for years afterward. Her survival was considered almost miraculous, a story of resilience that fit neatly into the narrative of a hotel built on defiance of death. But in time, that story began to twist into something stranger. Guests staying in room 217 reported peculiar happenings, subtle but insistent. Lights flickered to life on their own. Suitcases were unpacked while travelers slept. Clothing appeared neatly folded and laid across chairs, as though an unseen maid were still tending to her duties. Many believe this is the work of Elizabeth Wilson's spirit, lingering in the place where she nearly lost her life. Unlike the terrifying specters that stalk horror films, the Lady of 217 is said to be protective, even helpful. Couples have described a maternal presence, as though someone were watching over them. Some men, however, have reported feeling distinctly unwelcome, with blankets tugged away in the night or the sense of being firmly pushed from the bed. It is as if Mrs. Wilson remains devoted to her work, but also to her own sense of propriety. In this, room 217 echoes another legend across the Atlantic, the Queen Mary's watchful crew. On the great ship, sailors who died on duty are said to linger, still pacing their stations, still keeping watch. At the Stanley, Elizabeth Wilson seems to play a similar role. She is not a restless ghost, but a guardian, keeping the hotel in order, ensuring the work is done, even when no one can see her. The stories grew, and so did the room's reputation. By the time Stephen King stayed there in 1974, room 217 was already whispered about among staff as different. His terrifying dream only amplified its aura, transforming it from a curiosity into a cultural icon. Today, it is the most requested room in the hotel, with waiting lists that stretch for months. Guests do not merely want to sleep there. They want to be part of the legend, to feel the touch of the unseen housekeeper who refuses to abandon her post. Skeptics, of course, offer explanations. Drafts cause lights to flicker. Overactive imaginations unpack the mystery. Yet even the most rational visitors admit there is something uncanny about 217. The air feels heavier, the silence thicker. Guests who arrive eager for a thrill sometimes leave shaken, unwilling to speak of what they experienced. Elizabeth Wilson's name may not appear in official history books, but within the walls of the Stanley, she is immortal. Her story blurs the line between survival and haunting, between duty and eternity. Room 217 is no longer just a suite. It is a shrine, a place where history and legend merge into one. And for those who spend the night within its walls, the question is never far away. Is the Lady of 217 still watching, still working, still keeping order in the shadows of the Stanley Hotel? If Room 217 is the heart of the Stanley Hotel, then its soul lingers in the grand halls where music once filled the air. The ballroom and concert hall, once stages for glittering galas and elegant soirees, now hold a reputation just as enduring, not for the parties that were, but for the echoes that refused to die. In the hotel's early years, these rooms were the height of refinement. The ballroom glowed under crystal chandeliers, its polished floor alive with the sweep of gowns and the rhythm of polished shoes. Guests waltzed late into the night, while music from the grand piano poured through the corridors like liquid gold. In the adjacent concert hall, Flora Stanley herself often performed, her fingers coaxing hymns and classical pieces from the keys of the organ. For a time, it seemed the Stanley was not just a hotel, but a temple of art, an unlikely cultural oasis at the edge of the wilderness. But as decades passed, the music faded. The galas dwindled, the great parties became memories. Yet guests and staff began to notice that the halls were not silent. Late at night, when the rooms sat dark and empty, the faint strains of piano music could be heard drifting across the air. Sometimes it was a few delicate notes, sometimes a full melody, played as though by invisible hands. More than one night guard has sworn he entered the ballroom expecting to find a guest lingering at the keys, only to discover the room empty, the piano lid closed, the silence oppressive. Others report laughter and whispers that seem to rise from nowhere. Tourists walking through on guided visits have paused, swearing they heard the echo of voices, men and women conversing in low tones, the cadence of another era. One guide recalled a moment when a group stood in the ballroom, their footsteps echoing against the walls, when suddenly everyone fell silent. From the far corner came the distinct sound of a woman's laugh, high, graceful, and fleeting. When the group turned, there was no one there. Even more unsettling are the apparitions. Guests claimed to glimpse figures in the mirrors. Women in 1920s gowns adjusting pearl necklaces, men in black tuxedos standing with glasses raised. These images often vanish as quickly as they appear, dissolving into the reflection of the living. For some, it feels like stepping into a party that never ended, a last ball caught forever between time and memory. Skeptics suggest echoes, faulty wiring, or tricks of acoustics in the cavernous rooms. Yet the consistency of the reports is hard to ignore. The same melodies, the same laughter, the same shadowy guests glimpsed again and again over decades. Just as the RMS Queen Mary holds stories of phantom orchestras and footsteps in long-abandoned salons, the Stanley too seems to replay its past for anyone willing to listen. What makes these halls so haunting is not only the phenomena themselves, but the atmosphere they create. Step inside after dark and you can feel it, the air charged, the silence heavy, as though the room itself is holding its breath, waiting for the music to return. Some visitors describe a peculiar sensation, the faint pressure of a hand guiding them toward the dance floor, or the brush of fabric against their arm as if another dancer had passed by. The Stanley's halls are not empty. They are alive with memory, with rhythm, with the ghosts of joy that refuse to fade. To walk through them at night is to glimpse the past superimposed upon the present, a party still in motion, a final waltz endlessly repeating. And perhaps that is the true haunting, not the terror of monsters in the dark, but the sorrow of voices and music that should have ended long ago, echoing still in a hotel that remembers more than it should. Every grand hotel carries echoes of its past, but at the Stanley, those echoes often take the form of laughter, the bright, unmistakable laughter of children. For decades, guests and staff have reported hearing the sound of little feet racing along the second-floor hallways, the playful giggles of children at play. Yet when the source of the noise is sought, the corridors are empty, their long carpets stretching into silence. The reports are remarkably consistent. Couples lying awake in their rooms describe the patter of footsteps running just beyond their door, quick, light, and full of life. Some hear a ball bouncing against the floorboards, others the faint squeak of a tricycle wheel. Parents, traveling with their own children, sometimes rise to check, only to find their sons and daughters sound asleep. In the morning, they ask the staff whether another family was checked into the same hallway, only to be told no children were staying there at all. One of the most frequently told stories involves the second floor, near the grand staircase. Tourists have described hearing the echo of hide-and-seek games, the hurried scuffle of running, followed by a sudden giggle from just around the corner. But when they turn, the corridor is bare. The long rows of identical doors and the soft gaslight of the sconces only deepen the uncanny effect, as though the building itself were looping fragments of its past, replaying the energy of long-gone guests. And then there are the drafts. Sudden gusts of cold air sweep through the corridors without explanation, even when all windows are sealed. Visitors describe a chill brushing past them, like a child darting by in play. In some cases, the air drops by 20 degrees in an instant, raising goosebumps along their arms. Combined with the laughter, the effect is deeply unsettling, a space that feels inhabited, but not by the living. The long corridors of the Stanley contribute to this sensation. They seem to stretch endlessly, lined with identical doors that make direction and distance difficult to judge. Guests often speak of disorientation, of walking down a hallway, turning a corner, and somehow ending up where they began. Some liken it to a labyrinth, others to a trick of time. A few even suggest the hotel itself rearranges its interior when no one is watching, trapping visitors in loops of space and sound. The phenomenon has its parallels in other haunted places. The RMS Queen Mary, for example, is said to contain living hallways where footsteps follow you and cold winds breathe down your neck. At the Stanley, the sensation is similar, though tinged with the innocence or the mockery of children's laughter. It is less threatening than tragic, less violent than playful. And yet, for many, it is somehow more chilling. After all, what could be sadder or stranger than children forever trapped in a place of luxury they never left? Who were these children? The records are inconclusive. Some speculate they were the children of wealthy families who vacationed at the Stanley in its early years. Others whisper of accidents, of lives cut short in the wilderness. But no matter the explanation, the stories remain. They are too frequent, too consistent, too impossible to ignore. The corridors of the Stanley are more than passageways. They are theaters of memory, replaying fragments of joy and mischief long after the players themselves are gone. Guests arrive expecting silence, but leave remembering footsteps, laughter, and games that never end. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all, that within the walls of the Stanley, even innocence lingers, not as memory, but as presence. Legends are one thing. Eyewitnesses are another. At the Stanley Hotel, it is not only curious guests who tell stories of the unexplained, but also the people who know the building best, the staff who walk its corridors every day and every night. Security officers, housekeepers, and tour guides have all come forward with accounts that are difficult to dismiss, not because they are sensational, but because they are so matter-of-fact. Take the night security team. Their job is routine: patrol the halls, check the locks, make sure guests are safe. And yet, again and again, they report phone calls coming in from rooms that are empty. The front desk lights up with a signal: Room 401, Room 428, Room 217. When the call is answered, there is nothing but silence on the line. The logs confirm the rooms are unoccupied, their doors locked, and still the phones ring. Some officers laugh it off as faulty wiring. Others, after enough encounters, grow uneasy. It's like the hotel is talking to itself, one former guard admitted. Housekeepers tell similar stories. More than one has entered a freshly cleaned room to find the bed unmade again, or the television humming with static though the remote lies untouched. One described stepping into a suite only to be overwhelmed by the sharp smell of cigar smoke, a scent she knew well from her grandfather, but long since absent from the Stanley, where smoking has been banned for decades. She turned, expecting to see a guest. The room was empty. Moments later, the smell was gone. Tour guides, too, have their share of encounters. They lead visitors through the grand halls, telling stories of Stephen King and Elizabeth Wilson, when suddenly the script writes itself. A laugh echoes down the corridor. A cold draft sweeps across the group. In one instance, a guide swore that every motion detector in the concert hall lit up at once, as though the room were filled with invisible figures moving in unison. When he opened the door, the space was silent, still, and empty. What makes these accounts so compelling is their consistency. The same smells, the same sounds, the same uncanny timing. Witnessed not just by thrill-seeking tourists, but by employees with no reason to invent tales. These are people with keys in their pockets and radios on their belts. People who lock the doors at night and switch off the lights. When they say the hotel feels alive, it carries weight. The parallels with other haunted icons, like the Queen Mary, are striking. On that ship, former crew speak of phantom footsteps and unseen sailors still performing their duties. At the Stanley, it is as though the staff has never fully left. Housekeepers still tidying rooms, managers still pacing the halls, unseen guests still smoking their cigars. Both places blur the line between history and haunting, between memory and presence. For many of the employees, these encounters change their relationship with the building. Some grow cautious, refusing to walk certain corridors alone after dark. Others embrace the stories, sharing them with pride as part of the Stanley's living identity. It's not just a hotel, one longtime maid confessed. It has a pulse. You feel it. Documented or not, these stories accumulate like layers of dust on polished wood. Each account adds weight to the sense that the Stanley is more than walls and windows. It is a vessel of experience, alive in ways science struggles to explain. And perhaps that is the truest ghost story of all. A hotel that refuses to be silent, speaking through the voices of those who know it best. By the late 20th century, the Stanley Hotel had reinvented itself. No longer just a fading relic of Colorado's Gilded Age, it became something far stranger and far more magnetic. A shrine to horror, a hub for paranormal tourism, and a place where fiction and reality blurred until they were nearly indistinguishable. The transformation began, of course, with Stephen King. His novel The Shining and the film adaptations that followed catapulted the Stanley into pop culture legend. Fans came in waves, not only to see the place that inspired the Overlook Hotel, but to walk its hallways and test their courage against the stories that clung to every wall. What they found was not a movie set, but something more unsettling, a living building that seemed eager to play along. Today, the Stanley embraces this identity. Ghost tours lead visitors into the depths of the hotel at night, weaving tales of Room 217, phantom music, and children's laughter in endless corridors. Paranormal investigators arrive with EMF meters and infrared cameras, setting up in the ballroom or the grand staircase, hoping to capture proof of what so many guests have already claimed to witness with their own eyes. The hotel even offers specialized spirited rooms for those seeking the full experience, accommodations where disturbances are almost expected, not avoided. Beyond the tours, the Stanley has become a cultural landmark for horror fans. Festivals of fear, horror film screenings, and even live performances of The Shining draw thousands each year. In its concert hall, once filled with classical music, fans now gather to watch Kubrick's film flicker across the screen or to meet authors and filmmakers who celebrate the legacy of supernatural storytelling. For a hotel that once struggled to fill its rooms, the cult of The Shining has become its lifeline. But those who come expecting only fiction often leave with something more troubling. Guests arrive excited, laughing, quoting lines from the film. They leave pale, subdued, unwilling to talk about the shadows they thought they saw, the voices they thought they heard, the inexplicable chill that followed them down the hall. One visitor recalled watching The Shining during a festival screening, only to hear a child giggle directly behind her seat, though she was sitting in the back row, with no one nearby. Another described entering the ballroom during a ghost tour and smelling cigar smoke so strong it made his eyes water, though no one in the group was smoking. The Stanley, in this way, has become more than a backdrop for a novel. It is an interactive story, a place where visitors participate in the haunting rather than merely hear about it. They come for the cult of King, but they stay, or sometimes flee, because the hotel itself has something to say. Whether skeptic or believer, no one leaves untouched by its atmosphere. Paranormal tourism has given the Stanley a second life, but it is a life infused with unease. The hotel thrives on its identity as the Overlook, yet the spirits reported within its walls seem indifferent to Hollywood. They manifest on their own terms, not for cameras, not for box office numbers. In doing so, they remind every guest that while The Shining may be fiction, the Stanley strangeness is very real. The Stanley is not just a hotel, not just a cultural landmark, not just a monument to a best-selling novel. It is an experience, one that draws people from across the globe, inviting them to test their nerves, to confront the unknown, and to discover that the line between story and haunting is perilously thin. The Stanley Hotel stands today not merely as timber and plaster, nor as a tourist attraction carved into the Colorado mountains. It is something stranger, something heavier, a container of memory. Every brick, every corridor, every creaking door holds layers of history, preserved not as dates on a timeline, but as living echoes. Wealth and decay, music and silence, death and inspiration, all coexist here, refusing to fade. Walk its halls, and you can feel it. The chandeliers glitter with the light of long-forgotten galas. The corridors stretch like arteries, still pulsing with the laughter of unseen children. The ballroom resonates with phantom footsteps, the piano quietly waiting for hands that never come. Room 217 hums with the energy of a housekeeper who refused to leave her post. The Stanley does not remember in the way people do. It remembers as a presence, replaying fragments of itself again and again, until past and present blur. For more than a century, the hotel has survived cycles of prosperity and decline. It was born from the ambition of F.O. Stanley, nearly lost to neglect in the mid-20th century, and resurrected through the imagination of Stephen King. Along the way, it has gathered not only stories, but lives. Guests who arrived with laughter and left with fear. Employees who tended its rooms in daylight and swore never to walk them alone at night. Each moment adds to the weight of the building itself, until the Stanley feels less like a hotel and more like a living archive. Is it haunted? Or is it something deeper, a kind of echo chamber where the strongest moments of human experience refuse to dissolve? Skeptics will insist it is all psychology, isolation, expectation, suggestion. But those who have stayed here, who have heard the whispers in the halls or felt the chill of an unseen hand, are rarely so certain. They leave with questions, unsettled by the possibility that the Stanley is not just a hotel, but a portal, a threshold to something we cannot fully name. The parallels to other haunted icons, like the Queen Mary, are striking. Both began as monuments of progress, both declined, and both now survive as legends, vessels too saturated with memory to simply rest. Yet the Stanley carries a unique weight. It is not adrift on the ocean, but rooted in the silence of the mountains, a palace of light set against eternal wilderness. That silence, that isolation, gives its hauntings a particular edge. Here, in the Rockies, the echoes feel sharper, the shadows deeper. And so the question lingers, is the Stanley merely a legend, a ghost story fueled by imagination and pop culture? Or is it something more, a living structure, one that absorbs the lives of those who pass through it and holds them close, unwilling to release them? What is certain is this: the hotel endures. It breathes. It waits. Each visitor who steps across its threshold adds another layer to its story, another whisper to its halls. Some leave with only memories of beauty. Others leave shaken, unwilling to speak of what they experienced. But the Stanley does not stop. It listens. It remembers. And it is still waiting for new stories to unfold, perhaps yours.